Welcome to Drop the Mic. This episode features Maria Kithcart, Professor of Business at Spartanburg Methodist College. She has over 20 years of experience in marketing, and she has a great reputation for displaying a great attitude towards students, faculty, and staff, and in life. In this episode, we will be talking about how one can learn how to control their own emotions. Take a look. Professor Kithcart, welcome to the show. I'm glad to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. So when it comes to emotional intelligence, it can have a whole bunch of meanings. But in your perspective, what does emotional intelligence mean to you?
Sure, that's a great question. Emotional intelligence, to me, is really our own ability as human beings to kind of control what's on the inside, the way that we feel, the way that we react to things. It's also about recognizing other people when they're maybe not at their finest moment emotionally, recognizing that perhaps a person's at their threshold or a little beyond that when it comes to seeing their own emotions. So it's not just about self-awareness and controlling the things that I can control, what's in my span of control, but also recognizing and having empathy for other people. There's a bit of research that I've done on this topic, and one story in particular, which I think is quite telling in terms of giving maybe perhaps an extreme example or a very clear example of emotional intelligence in someone who's been able to rise above their very strong feelings to perform the task at hand. Looking at this from an organizational perspective, I've done a lot of research on the life and work of Marshal Choikov, and in his memoirs, he shared about a particular Red Army soldier by the name of Yukhim Renyemnyuk. I think I pronounced that correctly. The reason why I talk about this, I've even shared it in class with my students, is because during World War II, this individual's entire family was either wiped out, annihilated, or kidnapped and taken for slave labor back to the Third Reich. And so there was a time when Choikov's 8th Guards Army went to Poland, and during their campaign there in July of 1944, they liberated Majdanek, which was a concentration camp, a large one outside the town of Lublin. This soldier, Yukhim, that I mentioned, had these devastating things that happened to him. In fact, one of the things he had told his fellow soldiers as they were going through and liberating the West long before they got to Poland was that he invited his fellow soldiers over to his home to meet his family, to enjoy the farm. They actually went through that territory, and that's when he found his family basically wiped out and the neighborhood destroyed. And so as these soldiers continued on marching toward Berlin via Poland, and they came across this concentration camp, the orders from Choikov was to, take prisoners. So if they came across any SS or any camp administrators or whatever, to take those people prisoner. Well, this soldier, and like many other soldiers, would have been, I guess, not necessarily within his rights to do so, but you couldn't really blame them if they had taken out their revenge on these soldiers that they had captured. However, Yukhim rose above his very strong emotions of hatred and revenge, and actually brought a prisoner, a soldier, a Nazi SS soldier, to HQ for them to question. And so when Choikov saw this, he recognized this is what true heroism looks like. It's rising above, doing what you're required to do, what you're responsible to do, what you've been asked to do in an organization, and holding your emotions, even the strong emotions, in check. Being able to simply do what you're supposed to do. When I think about that story in particular, it serves as a reminder for me that there may be hot button items that will trigger an emotional response, but I have to remember the setting I'm in. I have to remember my colleagues and their feelings as well as my students. So it really is a good reminder about keeping one's self in check and being self-aware.
That's great that you mentioned that, because when it comes to emotional intelligence, of course we always have to get it together with ourselves, but it's just also the impact we have on others.
Right.
So,
Well, and I appreciate you bringing up the impact on others, because in leadership positions, we should be modeling behaviors that we want other people to emulate. And so that's another aspect, I guess, of thinking about emotional intelligence, is that people are watching. They watch how we react to things. And where we are in our weakest moments tells a bit more about our character, too.
Would you say you've been good at controlling your emotions, or is that something you had to learn?
Now, Michael, I'm human just like everybody else. There have been times where I have certainly been at the threshold and didn't recognize it within myself and crossed that threshold. In other words, I didn't really control my strong feelings in a way that I should have. One trigger that I found out, and part of being self-aware is understanding your triggers. What is it that pushes you to that point? It had to do with my son when he was in elementary school. There was a child that bullied him, and I witnessed an event that took place after school, where this child who was behind my son in line coming out to the playground after school, picking up a kickball and just hurling it as hard as he could at my son and hitting him on the arm. And it scared him because he wasn't expecting it. Well, I can tell you, I saw red. Now, that's not my general personality. But there are just certain triggers where, and I didn't even realize that about myself until this happened. And then after the fact, I went back and reflected and thought, well, okay, well, that is a hot point for me. So long story short, as I was driving up, I saw this event take place, and I just saw red and kind of snapped. I went and found that child on the playground. I did not touch him. I certainly didn't swear at him or use strong language, but I kind of got in his face. Now, again, stepping back from this, I probably could have handled it a little differently. I was coming to my son's defense in that regard, and realized after the fact, wow, okay, I don't know where that strong emotion came from. I guess it's just a defense mode that mothers often feel. And so recognizing that later, I thought, okay, this is something I'm going to have to watch out for so I don't end up in a situation like that again. So.
Well, I'm sorry that happened to your son.
I think it's just that parental urge to protect your child. That sometimes we have strong instinctual things that rise to the surface depending upon the situation. That circumstance taught me to be a little more self-aware and to recognize that, okay, this is a trigger and this is something I'm going to have to be aware of, and try not to let that emotion get to the point where I act out or do something. So I think part of it, going back to the original question about what emotional intelligence is, it's about knowing what your limit is and not letting yourself get that close to the limit. Knowing you're going that direction and then pressing the pause button.
It's good to hear.
And I find, going back to understanding human emotions that I observe, I think about the interactions I have with my students. There are times where, as department chair, I have the opportunity and the challenge of working with students, especially when there's a difficult scenario that they're facing in class or outside of class. And part of what I see my role is that I have an opportunity to help them sort through the emotional mess and find out, well, what are the major issues we're looking at here. Let's see if we can distill it down from, yes, I know you're upset, but let's figure out if we can focus on what the main issue is. And if we can determine what that main issue is, then we can make a route forward. We can come up with a plan. We can handle the scenario. So part of it is, like you say, de-escalation. People want to know that they're heard. So I think being an emotionally intelligent person involves active listening, and to really listen, not just to listen to develop a response, but to actually internalize what another person's telling you. That's something I've been working on for years, Michael. I don't have that mastered yet in life. I mean, that's a point of self-awareness for me in terms of just really concentrating on having good listening skills and then being able to reflect back to that person. All right, this is what I hear you say. Am I correct in understanding where you're coming from? So being able to listen and then communicate back to affirm what the other person has said to me, that's part of the de-escalation process as well. Giving a person an opportunity to have a sounding board to just share what's on their heart in a way that's transparent and authentic allows them to kind of go through that. Okay, I got that off my chest now. Now I can move to the next thing. So I would say that having the opportunity to do that in those stressful situations for students has been helpful.
We're all human. We're still learning every
Yes.
single day. We're trying to apply that inquisitive mindset, trying to be inquisitive in what we do. So, moving forward to asking, when you're in an emotional state, what do you do to mitigate that tensity of that episode?
Yes. Well, part of it is recognizing what your limits are. And so there are certain things, we've already talked about a couple of items today that I know that's over my threshold. But when I try to pay attention to what I'm feeling inside. And if I feel this anxiety that's arising up, or if I feel frustrated, I press the pause button. I really try to do that. It may mean that I have to disengage from a conversation for a few minutes so I can allow myself time to calm down. It may mean not giving an answer immediately, again, to process what I've gained to try to come up with the best scenario. There's a book that I read several years ago by one of Harvard, well, it was published by Harvard University, and the author is Joseph Badaracco, and it had to do with quiet leadership, going back to the issue of leadership and emotional intelligence and being effective. There's a temptation for leaders to make quick decisions, that we have to feel like we're decisive and have to handle things immediately. Well, depending upon the degree of circumstance there, whether it is a true emergency, well, that's one thing. But most of the things that you and I encounter in a day don't have to be handled like that. Quiet leadership is where we go back, we press the pause button, we step back from the scenario, ask advice, get all the facts, before we overreact or try to act too quickly without taking all stakeholder perspectives into consideration. And so quiet leadership is something I also try to practice as well. Being authentic in terms of, if I'm having a rough day, if I'm having an emotional day, my mother passed away back in January. There have been a couple of days I've been at the office where I haven't been 100%. rather than trying to hide that and compartmentalize myself as a person, thankfully my staff, my faculty members and my division have been very understanding. But, part of it is just going back to quiet leadership, understanding that we're not always going to be at 100%, and then recognizing the fact of, if I make a decision now in haste out of this emotional response, am I going to be short-sighted in this decision making? Am I going to do something that could actually become harmful in the future or would be short-sighted?
That's wonderful. And we're always in the heat of the moment. We don't know what we're doing. A lot of things can come across our mind. But it's just always important, to just calm down, self-reflect, and then just come back to it. It doesn't always have to be in a rush. Still have time. Just come back calm and collective. Because the more you're emotionally impulsed, things start to scatter.
Well, I agree with that. And I think, just reflecting a bit more about self-awareness and emotional intelligence, something that I've battled for years was anxiety. And in looking at human conflict, because that's another trigger for strong emotions, where we have to keep ourselves in check if we're going to have a positive resolution to such conflict. Thinking about conflict in the past always gave me great anxiety. I was definitely a conflict avoider and saw that as a path for controlling my emotions. Well, I've learned over the years that conflict is not necessarily duking it out with somebody. If you can sit down and have a good, controlled conversation where both parties are addressing an issue and not attacking each other personally, but actually objectively looking at a scenario to improve communication, then conflict can be a very positive thing. I think in our society, we've often attached that negative aspect to conflict where people like me fear it or try to avoid it like the plague. And so that's been another area that I've tried to focus on and tried to grow in regarding emotional intelligence and how that's handled during a conflict scenario, where I realize that I don't have to allow my emotions to get that involved with it, that I can work through a conflict solution without getting upset or without seeing the other person getting upset. So that I would say that through life experience, hopefully I've gained a healthier perspective where I was like, oh no, it's conflict, I want to run away from that. It's taken years to get there though. I would say now that there are different personality tests and such that you can take to help you become more self-aware in how you handle your emotions. And one of those aspects is tolerance for ambiguity. I found that as I've gotten older, I'm a little more easygoing when I don't know what the direction is, when life is a little chaotic. I'm grateful for that because I would say as a younger person in my 20s, that if life was a little chaotic, I would get very anxious. And my anxiety was more of a physical type of symptom where I would physically hurt over the anxiety. It would make me hurt inside. That's kind of an extreme example of anxiety, but if you've ever experienced that, or if any of our listeners have ever experienced that before, then it's a very painful thing that you want to avoid. So as I've gotten older, I've learned a bit more of tolerance for ambiguity. And I have to remember the tests that you can actually do for yourself, where you can get a kind of a handle on what is your level of tolerance for ambiguity. But as I've gotten older, I would say that having lived through a few storms of life, you learn that, okay, I'm resilient. I've seen this before. I know how the movie ends. We're okay. Everybody lives. It's going to be all right. And it does give you a different perspective.
That's awesome. So, to the people out there who are in the midst of having emotional intelligence, there are some problems that do come along the way. What are the common problems that people face when it comes to emotional intelligence?
Wow. Well, thinking about it from an organizational framework, it's easy to get into fights with people. We're talking physical altercations. If we have people, and we're talking about two parties at least, who are not in control of their emotions, that can lead to some severe outcomes. We hear about people who kind of lose it at work, or if they bring a weapon to work, that emotional intelligence is kind of gone out the window. It can lead to some dangerous scenarios. So I can see where having emotional intelligence training in organizations, first of all, would be very helpful. And then also having leadership where emotional intelligence, this is part of what I would say is woven into the fabric of the culture of the organization, where we talk about issues, we face conflict head on, but in ways that lead to a better outcome, to better communication. Hopefully that kind of addresses your question, but when you think about the extreme outcomes of this, it could be that someone ends up getting injured or even killed. This is why it's such an important topic, I think, in our society, and quite timely, to be honest, in our society, because we are facing a lot of stress. We are facing a lot of uncertainty when it comes to what does the future hold. It feels kind of chaotic right now. So I think those situations put together cause people to feel at unease, cause them to be a little on edge anyway. And so recognizing that this is where we are and this is how maybe we can have some more positive ways of addressing these issues and thinking through them, and again pressing that pause button, that hopefully we're going to have some good outcomes from that. But again, if allowed to escalate, it could lead to a violent situation. Violence, we think of that in terms of it not being a helpful way, not being a healthy way of dealing with conflict. However, it is a go-to for some people. And, if that's something where we can be a bit more proactive in how we, especially in organizations, but also just as a society, try to find better ways to connect with each other, better ways of handling conflict, maybe some of those tendencies would decrease.
Yeah, in today's society, when it just comes to conflict, it's usually violence it's just usually violence most of the time. But I would say the more we have community, the more we have things like this, that's how the world can just peace. That's how can literally have peace.
Well, and I think one of our biggest, and I agree with you, and I think one of our biggest issues, even moving forward today, is in the political realm. Now, this is not a political conversation, but just to hear me out, we tend to be very close to our political perspective. And, we often hear that in organizations or even with your friends, don't talk about religion, don't talk about politics. Well, if we can approach it from an academic, objective perspective, there's nothing wrong with talking about those topics, but everybody's got to be on the same page. And what tends to happen is, instead of, pretend I have a ball, all right? So if I hold the ball away from me, this is being objective. I can look at the ball. I can see that the ball has flaws. I can see that there are issues. There's strengths about the ball. There's weaknesses about the ball, but I'm not emotionally attached to that ball. I'm holding out here. What tends to happen in those heated conversations, I would say, that come about with especially politics, is that we take that ball, we bring it here. So now we're subjective about the ball. This is my ball. How dare you talk about my ball? Okay. So when we bring in these topics, no matter what it is, and we attach our emotions to that, we become subjective. Then this is where the personal attacks come in. Well, if you don't agree with my beliefs, well, does that mean you're attacking me personally? It doesn't have to be that way. We can agree to disagree and talk about things from a very objective, dispassionate, unattached kind of perspective. And I think looking at objectivity is also key to emotional intelligence. In other words, I'm not going to attack you as a human being because I have nothing against you. We're going to talk about this charged, maybe controversial topic, but you and I, it's not going to affect our relationship. We can talk about this objectively, and we respect each other. We're open with our opinions, but at the end of the day, if we need to agree to disagree, that's okay. We're still great friends. There's still an emotional friendship connection there that even talking about this difficult topic did not drive a wedge between the two of us. And so I think in looking at the issues that tend to be divisive, if we could all agree to approach them from a very objective perspective, we don't attack each other personally, and it doesn't feel personal.
Absolutely, because that's a great point that you just made. We can always agree to disagree, but the problem is that people take it to heart, and that's when the friendship is called to quits.
Right.
So you can always agree to disagree, but you can still remain friends. You can still you can still be at a mutual agreement. To the people out there who are struggling with gaining emotional intelligence, what are some ways that people can better their emotional intelligence?
Sure. I think that it takes an effort. You have to really make the effort and decide that you want to pursue having greater emotional intelligence. So first of all, it's making that commitment not only to other people in your lives, but to yourself. That instead of jumping to conclusions or flying off the hammer, so to speak, flying off the handle, to press the pause button. And then another helpful thing, we have to talk about this in therapeutic situations, is keeping a journal. And then also trying to get on top of what are the triggers? What is it that, man, it takes me from 0 to 240 in 2 seconds? What is it that puts me in orbit? What are the triggers that really drive that strong emotional response? Because knowing that's half the battle. If you know what your triggers are, then you have a better idea of, okay, these are the things I probably need to avoid. All right. But also finding a way to understand what your limits are too. And taking that time to take a breather, meditate, pray, redirect your thoughts. So it's really a learned discipline. Listening, of course, listening skills, gaining listening skills, but all of these things really boil down to making it a discipline for life, putting things into practice, and having friends who are honest with you, that you can be honest with them. Having, as you talked about earlier, about having that community of people that you trust, that trust you, where you can be open and talk about the things that bother you and get another person's perspective. I would think, too, that learning empathy is another way of addressing emotional intelligence. that until I've walked a mile in someone else's shoes, it's going to be hard for me to understand where they're coming from. Or until someone walks a mile in my shoes. So learning empathy, I think, comes with life experience. Part of it comes with maturity, part of it with life experience, but also approaching this pursuit through journaling, learning more about yourself, finding ways to recreate the narrative. In other words, where perhaps we've seen life from a negative perspective before, how is it that we can turn that narrative and pursue the positive things in life instead? Yeah, how is it that we can take a bad situation and turn it to the good? Those are just a few things that come to mind, but I think having open and honest communication with the people in your life that you love, that you're close to, I think is a good step in the direction as well. Knowing that you're accountable for our actions, what I do, both for my personal and professional life, I'm responsible for that, good or bad or indifferent, and recognizing that we do have a responsibility. We live in a very individualistic society, but at the end of the day, there is at least some level of responsibility that we have to our fellow humans, right? Part of that comes to treating other people with respect. I've had people in my life before who have felt disrespected, and my response to that is, well, I understand how that feels. I've been through that before, but don't let something like that change who you are as a person. I think being true to a person's self, in other words, if you automatically try to befriend and respect others, we can't allow the things that happen to us that people perpetrate against us to change who we are, to our character.
In life, there's a lot of things can happen personally or academically. But for you, Professor Kithcart, when you're in the midst of adversity, how do you overcome it?
Oh, goodness. Well, I reach out to my friends who keep me grounded, to be honest with you. There are times where when you're going through therapy, I'll say this as well, you start digging up things from the past and you find that it's right there at the surface. So emotional intelligence is especially important through those times. And it's been important for me to have at least one or two people who I trust with my entire life that I can go to and that they pick up the phone and we talk through. I would say that that's been a genuine lifesaver and has definitely kept me off the ledge, so to speak. Just having at least one person who knows where I'm coming from, who knows how to talk me through the situation. I would say that everybody needs to have a friend like that. And if you don't have a friend like that, this is where we need to seek a friend like that who can be there with you and accepts you for who you are.
That's great. Having a strong support system is great. It's
Yes.
also important too. You can't just go through everything alone.
I think that's kind of a lie that we tell ourselves as humans, that we're totally alone, that nobody understands. And I do call that a lie because in reality, we have a lot of people who really care about us, people that we may not even realize who could be there for us, that sort of thing, that they see our value and that they love us. And so we're never alone. I think that's another part of emotional intelligence too, is recognizing the fact that even though I feel a certain way, there are facts that say that I am not in that scenario. In other words, I may feel like I'm totally alone going through difficulty, but the facts are that I have a lot of people in my life who are wonderful friends who would do anything to help in situations like that. So I think it's learning how to see the bigger picture too.
It's amazing. And to wrap up, because it's been great to have you here on the podcast. To the viewer out there, to the person out there that wants to be emotionally intelligent, but they're experiencing overwhelmingness, what would you say to that person? How could they take action today?
Okay. Well, thinking about that, we've talked about a number of different tactics that a person can adopt to learn how to be more emotionally intelligent, etc. When the anxiety strikes and the overwhelmness comes in, we have to recognize it for what it is. It's kind of an emergency response from our system. In other words, this is kind of like a gut reaction or an initial reaction to something where that may not be our reality. So in other words, what we think we perceive to be real may not be real, if that all makes sense. But part of it is, I think, when you're finding yourself in an overwhelming situation, is having whatever your go-to is. One thing that's worked for me, and I'll share this, is bilateral music, which is where if you wear earphones, you have one in each ear, obviously, you have music that will stimulate both sides of your mind. And so when you have a tool like that, it can help you to back away from that anxiety, from that feeling of being overwhelmed. So I definitely recommend, that's something I would use too. I didn't mention that earlier, but that is a tool that can be used to kind of help you exit out of that feeling of being overwhelmed. Also trying to clear your mind, because what happens in a situation where we're overwhelmed or overstimulated, our thoughts are just racing and it's hard to concentrate on one thing. And part of that is slowing things down, slowing the mind down. It's a learned discipline. But finding a way to trying to decelerate that overstimulation and to think about having a sense of calm, whether it's aromatherapy or if it's wiggling your toes, is something to kind of redirect your thinking. But it can be overcome, and part of it is finding what works for you. I definitely recommend for people who have issues with feeling overwhelmed, with having that level of anxiety, to do a little bit of research. It may be worth talking to your family doctor as well, and trying to find an approach to it that addresses the situation chemically, to see if you can kind of calm those urges down when they happen. So hopefully it's something where you maintain a bit more evenness or even-keeled properties in your reactions, rather than having those times where you feel completely overwhelmed.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Yeah. And also, I would want to add on, you could also take deep breaths.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well.
Yes. Breathing is therapeutic.
I remember Harvard did this study. Have you ever heard of the power pose?
Okay, tell me.
Study. So basically, when you're anxious, when you're nervous, or to increase confidence, you would hold this pose for 2 minutes. And within those 2 minutes, you're doing deep breaths. And study shows that when you do the power pose, it drops your cortisol level and it increased testosterone as well.
Oh. So you're talking about like the Wonder Woman pose, where you're standing with your hands on your hips and, and then breathing.
Yeah, or any pose that you do. You hold it for, you breathe, you take deep breaths for 2 minutes, and just like that, it just helps increase confidence.
That's
and
amazing.
It drops your cortisol level and it increases testosterone.
That's wonderful. I have heard about that before, now that you mention it. One other thing I've done as well is listen to Native American flute music. Is very, very relaxing. It is de-stressing. Again, very therapeutic. I think the more that you can get into a situation where You have sights and smells, and you have sounds that are very soothing. And breathing, of course, is all a part of calming down your nervous system. That's an important part of practicing good emotional intelligence.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's been wonderful to have you on my podcast. Where can the people out here follow you? You have like any social media platforms?
LinkedIn would work on LinkedIn, and I am on Facebook and Instagram, but mostly on LinkedIn.
Okay.
Yeah.
It was great to have you, as always.
Thank you.
And that wraps up this episode. I'm your host, Michael Usor. This is Professor Maria Kithcart, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.